So, welcome everybody. Welcome to the podcast Unpacking Organizations, where Rupert and I talk about our passion topics and help you unpack some of the topics that we deal with on our day to day.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue. See tomorrow's business, today.
So, Rupert, we recently talked about always on transformation. And that got me thinking that many a times the transformation is done for cost cutting. People say that, we are very heavy and we need to be in a more lean model structure. We are very expensive, or we are fat in the middle. We should be pyramid, but we are actually a fat diamond. And often, in order to get there, spans and layers is considered the criteria. Like that is the biggest tool that is applied, that you increase the spans, reduce the layers, slash the managers, um, and you will get to the right size. But I feel there is more around it, because there is when we do spans and layers, it's applicable for, say, operations or places where there is a scale of economy, but it isn't that much of, or sorry, I would say that it is more applicable into the corporate functions where we are actually having the managerial layer and so on. But when there is a scale of economy and operations, that does not work, because there are many other criterias that actually work in order to think about right sizing. And I know that in your book you have a full chapter dedicated on right sizing. So I thought it would be really helpful for our listeners to go through that. So there's an acronym that you have created.
Mhm.
So tell us more about that, and let's unpack that today.
Great. No, thank you. I mean, where this started for me, probably about 20 years ago, close to 20 years ago, I was with a client and we were doing all the design and we had done all the activities and the process maps and the accountability maps. And we had the broad structure. And then we said, well, how many of each role do we need? And how do we get to the answer? And this was in the context of quite a mathematically literate client. And it was in the supply chain of a consumer goods company. And we wanted to do it correctly, and they said, so how do you do this? And being mathematically minded myself and an economist, I'm like, well, I want to have a method for actually coming to an answer and then judging that, and not just falling to the simplicity of taking the as is and changing it, because we radically changed the organization. So we, from first principles, what do we need? And often, people talk about zero-based budgeting as an example, right? Let's throw out where we are right now, because we're changing so much from first principles. How do we get to this number? Which is really healthy, because just slashing and cutting and saying, oh, I need to take 20% out, and that's the answer, and doing it through negotiation and pressuring and bullying and saying, well, you've got to go deeper, it's not good enough, with no basis, just really feels poor. And also what you raised in terms of the spans and layers, say, oh, we need 8 spans. And so, as if 8 spans is a magic number, and if you don't have 8 spans, it's a problem. And I even know clients who've got an official and an unofficial organization. The official, everyone has spans of 8, but the unofficial, the way it really works is they don't. They're just doing it to protect their jobs, because they're like, if I don't have a span of 8, I'm going to be a target. So it was really silly, because sometimes the span of control of 1 makes total sense, because you're more of a player coach and you're doing a lot of work yourself. So it's very dangerous, I think, to look at just oversimplicity, which is just our spans. And the reason it's so prevalent is because it's so easy. People just, I know, if we reduce the spans, on average, we're at 5, and if we make it 8, here is the saving. We can get rid of 200 managers. The average salary of a manager is X. Boom, look at the big prize. And guess
So
what? You're not looking at the work.
mathematical, so convincing that
So
yes, this many
convincing.
million
Yeah.
dollars is out of the gate.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So so for me, and as you said, there isn't just one way of doing it because different roles require a different approach. So the acronym, and I love to invent acronyms, is FIDRAM. Doesn't exactly flow off the tongue. It's not a TLA. It's not 3 letter. I'm pushing it. I'm going for six. There are 6 letters. Um, so the F is fixed. There are some roles that are fixed. You only need one of them or a number. So I only need one CEO, one CFO, etc. It's a fixed number and I can't change it. The I is incremental. So what that is, let's say I've got my R&D function. I can't do maths. I can't say, well, based on the drivers, I just have to work out how much am I prepared to invest in this group of activities. And so that's incremental. I might say I need to incrementally increase by 20% or reduce by 20% because I don't have a driver to get to the answer. And that's the third acronym, which is D for driver, FID, fixed, incremental, D for driver. So a driver could be sales and the number of sales reps, and I look at the productivity, how much should each sales rep attain, multiply by the sales target, um, adjust for learning curve, and I have my driver. Then
And
the
driver is also very linear in that sense.
it's totally linear. A driver is
Right,
linear. Yeah, it's a
right.
linear driver. Um, so and you might assume with time some enhancements in productivity. So you might change that the sales number changes and the productivity number might change. So that number can change over time. So I'm what I'm actually doing without even realizing is I'm moving into workforce planning. But from an org design perspective, you have your assumptions for that point in time because you're doing it for the 2B, right? Then the R is ratio. So ratio is like a special type of driver. So an example, I've got my software developers, the engineers, and for every one of those, I need one. For every 4 engineers, I need one QA person, and then I then have a half a UX person.
Two
Um,
testers.
that's right. So those are ratios.
Right,
And another ratio. I mean, a spanner control is a ratio, so you can have a span break. So I need team leaders; they can manage this number. So a
right.
spanner control is a ratio. Uh, so there you start you work out the drivers first, and then some have ratios. You work that out. The
And
next
the
one,
ratio, sorry, I just want to highlight that the ratios are also a good thing to do about enabling functions, right? Like if you have X number of people, how many HR people would you need as a HR business partners or things like that? Is that right to say?
it could be. I mean, I think it's slightly dangerous with that example
Okay.
because people then look for benchmarks
Hmm.
and and then they say, well, the ratio is 1 to 100, and the implicit assumption is if you had the ratio of 150, you're more effective, and that's
That's a fantastic
dangerous,
point.
right? Because
Right,
I
right.
if I say people are at the heart of our strategy, and I have to look at and this is the next one, is the activity. So
Hmm.
FIDRAM, so we got ratio and then activity, and what is the work that's needed? And it might be, for instance, if we take your HR example, I want to do more L&D. I
Hmm.
want to do more OP&A. I want to do um, thinking about
More
more
talent
talent
management and
acquisition
right.
so I might
Hmm.
want to invest a lot more to improve the life cycle for all employees, and that is an investment, and so therefore I might need for every 80 people one person, and actually as I get bigger I can get more economies of scale, so because I put systems in place, so it changes. So I think looking at the
That's a
work and
great
what work you
example,
need to do,
Rupert.
um,
Right.
which is the danger of benchmarking. So the big
Hmm.
danger in right sizing is everyone looks at benchmarks. And if you copy, it's like, do you want to be someone else or do you want to be yourself? And if you copy someone else, you're going to get. It doesn't mean who's to judge what's best practice anyway for you in your industry, given what you're trying to deal with. Um, the last acronym, the last letter in the acronym is M, and this is mathematical modeling. And I've done this as well. I did it actually in the context of healthcare and chemotherapy and radiotherapy. So you when you have dynamics, when you have patients flowing in, quite complex process flows, you have different technologies. Uh, then you have if too many patients arrive at the same time in the morning, there's a queuing effect and there's a build up and bottlenecks through the system. So if you try and model certain environments with a linear deterministic approach, you will end up making flawed assumptions. And so mathematical modeling, we look at variation as well. So if you're thinking about a call center, what is the volume of calls that come in? What kind of service levels do you want to achieve given the fluctuation? You start to model that so you can hit things like I want to, you know, resolution in 4 minutes at 98% of the time. These kind of SLAs that you put in place, and the demand is fluctuating, and there's queuing effects, and you can't model it as a deterministic system. Then you move to mathematical modeling. Now the thing is that the as you go through the acronyms, it becomes more complex and therefore less frequent. So mathematical modeling is a technique that you only have to apply in rare exceptions,
Right.
right? But
And
almost
if you
by
apply it
exception.
once, you can use it several times, because if you tweak a
Correct.
little bit of not the formulas, but the constructs or the parameters of those formulas, then you will be able to evolve that for the future. You don't
Yeah,
have to build it from the scratch every
yeah,
time.
yeah. Whereas if imagine if you're starting a business like a startup, which I've done now a few times, you start everything is fixed. There is no drivers, there's no ratio. You have one of everything. There aren't many, and you're multi-hatting. So you always have fixed is always part of the playbook. Um, as you start scaling and growing, then you start thinking, oh, we can make these incremental investments. Let's use the drivers. Now we're moving to maturity. We've got to think about ratios. I'm becoming more sophisticated. Actually, I'm becoming even more sophisticated. I really need to understand the work and then the workforce. If you reference our previous podcast on the activity system, so so that's another way of looking at it. So although there are 6 different techniques, you're not applying all 6 in the same number of times all the time.
I really like that spread, Rupert, because then it also tells us the maturity of the organization. It That is a consideration or a parameter that we need to think about. It also talks about that as you start to get into activity and the modeling, the workforce planning starts to come into play, right? That is where it starts to start. So there's an overlap about different systems as well that you are right sizing, but then you're also building that capability as you grow on how to think about the size of the organization based on the maturity and the complexity of the organization. So I love the spread: FIDRAM, fixed, incremental, driver, ratio, activity, and modeling. Great. So, what is one takeaway that you have for our listeners?
Don't go and apply spans as your method for right sizing. Don't go and take some set of benchmarks, doesn't matter how well intended, and use that as the way of calculating how many positions you need for your organization so you can execute your strategy. And what's yours, Shradha?
Brilliant. I think it's important to see different parts of the organizations need different methodology. So I'm taking the leaf from your takeaway that don't go by one, but understand what needs what. Like what part of the organization need what kind of uh, the method, and go with that. Like do not just, even if you don't go for spans and layers, you still need to maybe have a couple of methods that you need to think about. It will still not be one, so
I
think
think it's
about that as
actually
well.
it's a great point, and there's a word that I love, triangulation. Like you don't have to use one method either. By the way, you can use two or three different lenses, different ways, as a way of saying, does this make sense? Because at the end of the day, you have a top-down budget of what you can afford. You have design principles like how many layers can we have, and given what you do, so you're constantly you're triangulating, and then you sit back and you have to use human judgment to say, does this make sense? Right, on the whole range. Is this going to help us execute? Is this affordable? Is this does it feel right? So as much as I love all the maths and the calculations, it's a tool to help get to an answer. And never is one method alone going to for anything going to be right, right? And that's the challenge in the questioning, and it's really that thought process and the thinking makes you more robust, which means let's say you do have in certain areas the need for downsizing and certain people are put at risk, then you can explain, this is what we went through, this is how we did it, this is how we got to the answer. It's a lot more palatable for people to then be like, you know what, this affects me negatively, but at least I know they've worked through it and they haven't been dogmatic, and there's logic, and you're a lot more likely to accept that than if it's just, top down, we need to cut 20%, and the kind of politics and the bullying that implies.
So true. Absolutely. So thank you so much, Rupert. This was very, very insightful. um, Thank you. So
Thank
until
you, Shradha.
next time,
On to the next.
take
Take
care.
care. Bye.